We can use Excel to help us standardize or normalize our scores. In other words, we can use Excel to help us calculate z-scores. Z-scores allow us to talk about particular scores within a set of scores. So for example, we can look at an individual score, such as this 87, and we can standardize it and then say whether it's equal to the mean, below the mean, or above the mean. We can even say how far or how close the score is to the mean. Z-scores also allow us to compare scores from different bunches of data or different sets of data. So for example, if we collected science scores from 2 classes instead of 1 class, the z-scores can help us compare them against each other. So to standardize the scores in Excel, we first need to take a look at the formula, which we have right here. We see by the formula that we create z-scores by subtracting the mean, this is the m, the mu, subtracting the mean from the individual score, x, and then we divide this result by the standard deviation. So essentially, to calculate a z-score, we need 3 pieces of information. X, the individual scores, which we have here in column A, the raw individual scores. We need the average, which we can calculate using Excel formulas. And we need the standard deviation, which we can also calculate in Excel formulas. These are the things we've been practicing and learning. So we have these 3 pieces. Excel then allows us to use what we call a standardized formula that takes all 3 pieces together and spits out a z-score. So if you look at the standardized formula, you can see that it's going to ask us to input the x, the individual scores, right here, column A, the mean that we're going to calculate using a formula, and then the standard deviation from a formula. Alright, so how do we do this? I set up our workbook, our worksheet right here to show you and demonstrate how we can do this quite easily. Column A, let's make sure we have all our scores in place, the individual raw scores. We've been working with this from the beginning. In column B, I set up our z-scores. So this is my label, and I'm going to leave these blank because this is where we'll calculate z-scores using that standardized formula. In column C, I have a place to calculate our average. And then in column D, I have a place to calculate our standard deviation. Okay, so let's start with the average first. I'm going to click here below average in cell C2. And remember, whenever we use formulas, the first thing we do is start with the equal sign. I'm going to start to type in average. Here's our average. And then again, just follow this little gray box, and it reminds you or it prompts you about how to input the formula correctly. So it's asking what numbers or what range of numbers do we want to calculate an average for. We want to get that on our raw test score, so I'm moving my cursor to A2. I'm going to click and drag all the way down to A20. Okay, so I want an average of all of our raw individual scores. Once that's in there, enter, and here's the average. Now let's calculate standard deviation. I'm going to move to cell D2. Same thing, let's start with the equal sign. And then look at the formula for standard deviation. Start typing that in, STDEV. We're going to use S, the standard deviation of the sample. Again, it's asking what numbers do we want to calculate the standard deviation for. I'm going to click here on A2, click and drag all the way down to A20. Right? So standard deviation of the sample for A2 to A20, and hit enter. Perfect. So now we have the average, standard deviation, and our raw scores. We have all 3 parts of the z-score formula. The last thing we need to do is actually calculate the z-scores. So let's calculate the z-score for 87, the raw score of 87. I'm going to put my cursor here in B2, and we're going to follow this formula right here, the standardized formula. So here's my cursor. Start with equals. I'm going to start to type in standardize. There it is. All right, see? Again, let's follow, right? It prompts us, let's follow what the formula is. Standardize, and then it says X. So it wants the raw score, or the individual score, which is 87. You see we need a comma. See in that gray box? We need comma. Then we need the mean. Our mean is right here in C2. Okay, look at the box, the gray box, comma, and then standard deviation right here, D2. And you can see as we input these in Excel, the text, the color of the text changes and it corresponds to the color of the cell, the shaded cell. So that's kind of nice. It tells you, right? A2 is this blue, C2 is red, here's the average, and D2 is purple, standard deviation. And let's hit enter. And there you have it. This is a z-score for 87. The z-score for 87 is 1.79 when we round that. Okay, so how do we populate or how do we calculate the rest of these z-scores? You could do what we just did and do it manually, but that takes way too much time, especially if you have tons of data. We only have 19 scores, but you can imagine if we had more, it would be really, really painful to have to type this in manually each time. So what we want to do is quickly populate this formula all the way down. But before we do that, we need to do one thing. We need to actually edit this formula and lock into place our average and standard deviation. And what I mean by that is that if I copied and paste this formula right now, so if I just Control C and Control V, okay, to copy and paste the same formula, I get this error code. Because look at what it is, okay? It's an error code, it says the number reference is funny. If I double click to look at what the formula is saying, it's pulling the right X, the right individual score, but it's pulling column C3 and D3, the average and standard deviation from here, which is not correct. There's nothing here, which is why the formula is breaking. We want to keep the average on here, on the C2 average. We want to keep the standard deviation on D2. Okay, so we can't just populate this. It's going to break. It's not going to work. So how we keep this, keep the average and the standard deviation, is that we enter in dollar signs before the C and before the 2. Also, before the D and before the 2. These dollar signs lock the cell in place, so when we populate or copy paste or replicate a formula in different cells, it will always, it's telling Excel to remember that, hey, you need to be locked in for the mean, it's always going to be C2. For the standard deviation, it's always going to be D2. Okay, it locks it in for us. So you can manually, again, enter in the dollar signs, just as I did. Another quick way is if you just click on the C2 anywhere there and you hit F4 on your keyboard. That also quickly populates it. Alright, so now when we try to copy paste this, so let's say I just Control C or Apple C, Control V, Apple V, look, I have a z-score now. And if I take a look at that formula really closely, I'm seeing that it's pulling the right X, the right individual score 27, but it's also pulling the right average up here in C2 and the right standard deviation in D2. Okay, and that's what we want. How to quickly populate this, the best way would be to do the quick double click method. So look at my cursor right now. If you look at my cursor, all right, it's that white cross, it's kind of big, but I want to click on B2 where the formula is, and I want to highlight or hover right on the bottom right of this cell. You see how my cursor changes from this white big cross to this black thin cross? Okay, again, white big cross, black thin cross. I want to hover there, and then right when I have it to where it changes to the black thin cross, I'm just going to double click. And when I do that, it quickly populates all of my z-scores for me, super nicely and super easy. And again, you can go on any one of these cells, any one of the z-scores, you can click on it, double click on it, and you can check, is my formula correct? Is it pulling the right X, the right individual score, the right average, and the right standard deviation? Yes. So that's a quick way to populate. I'll do it one more time. Okay, so let's say we just calculated the z-score for 87. We use the dollar signs to lock in our average and our standard deviation. Now I'm going to hover, I'm going to click on B2, I'm going to hover on the bottom right till my cursor changes and it's selected, and I'm going to double click. Super, super fast. Another way to do this instead of double clicking is you can make sure your cursor, again, hover on the bottom right, make sure your cursor changes to that thin cross, click and drag down. So if I click and drag, you can see I can go as far as I want, I can go back. Okay. And that works, but if you have, imagine, hundreds of rows of data, kind of painful to do this, right? To go all the way up or down, and it's possible you might miss one. So I do think the best way to populate your formula is to do the quick double click method, which ensures that you hit the bottom row. And that is how you calculate standard scores or z-scores in Excel using formulas.